Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last in our series of public Zoom sessions on getting stuff done, how ideas become policy. Today, we're joined by Tony Pipa, who I'll introduce in a minute, to talk about sustainable cities, what's working and why. We'll also touch on a few things that are not working. I just want to remind everyone that after we have a conversation, um, we'll very much welcome your questions. Just use the chat function to drop your questions in. I think everybody's got great Zoom protocol at this point. Microphones are turned off. You're absolutely welcome to have your cameras on. We'd love to see your shiny faces. And with that, let's get started. So we're really pleased to have Tony with us. Tony Pipa is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. The Center for Sustainable Development was launched a year ago, and it's a really important platform in Washington, engaging with others from around the world on the Sustainable Development Goals. He launched and leads an initiative at that center, Local Leadership on the Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll be talking about today, which works with mayors and local government officials to advance sustainable development locally, and also analyzes the emergence of city diplomacy and global cooperation among local governments. And I want to just note, this is an incredibly 21st century approach, both focusing on the role of cities in diplomacy, and we can also talk about whether or not we have everything we need bureaucratically on that front, but also in terms of local voice. Those are emerging themes in many dialogues around the world. So Tony came to Brookings after serving in the US Department of State during the Obama administration as special envoy to the UN to negotiate and adopt the SDGs. He was essentially between Elizabeth Cousins, who was our first guest in the public Zoom sessions, and then when I was finally confirmed. But Tony was there to make sure that everything didn't go sideways in terms of the US position on the SDGs, and was in the room, as they say, in this case, the General Assembly, when the SDGs were adopted. He also served in multiple senior policy roles at USAID. He was a fellow deputy assistant administrator when I was there, and he ended the administration, the Obama administration, as the chief strategy officer to the administrator, Raj Shah. So you've spent a lot of time over the last several years on this SDG agenda. Let's start with why you're interested in the SDGs as part of creating sustainable cities. What animates you about this agenda?
Well, first off, it's interesting to me, Sarah, as you were just saying, I was at the UN General Assembly negotiating on behalf of the US. That's a whole conversation in and of itself about what happened in those rooms and outside those rooms. But, we were sitting there from the perspective of a national government, right? And the SDGs are targets meant to be achieved by national governments and sort of aggregated up globally. And we had some stuff in there about local governments and what was important, that they might be, that they might have some role. But frankly, and we even have a goal. We have SDG 11, which is about sustainable, inclusive cities and resilient cities. But it's really from the perspective of a national government, right? And what was interesting to me is when I came to Brookings was to see how the SDGs, as this agenda that was negotiated at the UN, national government perspective, being adapted, adopted, and applied in different contexts. And to see the amount of energy actually that local leaders were giving to it. And what's really interesting to me is that the SDGs are really challenging because they ask, and sustainable development as a concept, I think, is really challenging because it asks policymakers to consider multiple dimensions of development at one time and try to encourage and drive progress on those things simultaneously. So it sees things in an integrated way. So the social human dimensions of development, things like poverty, hunger, education, the economic aspects of development, economic growth, good jobs, quality jobs, the inequality that happens in societies and between societies, and then the environmental sustainability side as well, action on climate change, biodiversity. And that's really hard. It actually almost becomes kind of theoretical at a national government level sometimes. It feels like it can get fairly abstract. But at the local level, this is where you see things that you see real solutions for real problems for real people. And you can see those connections being made across those different dimensions of development more concretely. And in fact, the kind of work that's happening at cities is really innovative. Like they weren't in the room when it happened, right? They were not they were not parties to this agreement, and yet they are seeing the value of what it might mean for their local communities, and they're doing some of the most innovative work that there is to actually try to use it and apply it for that kind of social progress for their constituents and for the neighborhoods they serve.
So that multi-dimensional aspect, I think, is incredibly important because it challenges not only governance structures at the national level or local government, but I think it's a challenge for those of us in education to teach and partner with the next generation in a very different way so that people understand, we all understand, both faculty, students, staff, the intersection of all these policy issues. That's not traditionally how we train. Certainly, political science, which was my specialty, or the discipline in which I was trained and have a PhD, is extremely siloed, both in terms of international versus national, international relations versus comparative politics, or any of those issues. And so we really need a 21st century vision of that. And a lot of us are thinking about how you do this, and community of practice is one way of doing that. So talk to us about what you've been doing specifically at Brookings on the creation of, number one, a community of practice. What is that? But the community of practice of cities working on the SDGs. So who's engaged? Why you think they're engaged? You've given us a little bit of that. And how it's developed and grown over the years. You were with us in April 2019 in Pittsburgh in person to talk about what was going on in Pittsburgh, but also we were joined by colleagues from Orlando, New York City. Of course, we poached Alex Hineker from New York City, the mayor's office at that point, or shortly after. So just give us a sense of the evolution of this initiative, but starting with what is a community of practice?
Yeah, so the community of practice and this idea actually grew out of demand, really, because when I started to talk to people at the local level for why they were pursuing those multiple dimensions of sustainable development and what they were finding challenging about it, but also what the opportunities were about it, they said, look, we're trying to figure this out. And I know there's a community of others out there trying to figure this out as well, but it's really hard for me to connect with them. And so what we decided to do was to convene a group of senior government officials. So these are government officials primarily from cities across the world. It's about, we started with about 15, we've added a few since. About a third of them are from the US. A third of them are other global north cities, and then a third of them are global south cities. And they range in size and capacity. So we've got, Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world, capital cities like Buenos Aires and Bogota. And then we have cities, that are more mid-size or what you would call intermediary cities like Pittsburgh, like Mannheim, Germany, Bristol in the UK, which is 7th largest metro area, in the UK. And it is a place for them to come together and to be the experts with each other, both to share their innovations and what's happening specifically in their city, but also look for commonalities amongst the challenges that they are hitting, as well as how collectively they might provide leadership to other counterparts across the world. And one of the things that I think really animates this group, so they were already in the vanguard. We looked for cities that had already said, okay, sustainable development is something that we are making a commitment around. It's not even just an interest, it's like a priority. We're going to take on these multi-dimensional issues and problems. We're going to see what we can do. And we're going to do it in a very evidence-based, outcome-based way. We're going to use the discipline of the SDGs, that time bound. We're going to get to a certain place by a certain time, and we're going to measure our progress for it. But they did it because they also feel like, and they were interested in how solving the issues that they're confronting locally is a bigger piece of the puzzle to global progress, and how to create sort of a global movement around that. And frankly, how the SDGs also provide them a platform for being able to understand what others are doing that they can apply at home. Like the best solutions are sometimes stolen solutions, right? And so they're looking for ways to do that. And the common language of the SDGs actually enables that, because they can all come together sort of from the same starting place. Now, like I said, we've even grown a little bit as a community of practice, but the movement of cities that are taking on sustainable development and that are pursuing the SDGs has grown enormously. So when we launched that community of practice, New York had just done and innovated, as you mentioned, Alex, she was the major part of this. Created a local review of progress for the SDGs in New York City, because they'd taken their city strategy and they had aligned it against the SDGs, and they said, countries at the UN are reporting on what their progress is like. We've already aligned our strategy. We should just say, here's what our progress is like as a city. And so they did the first, what we call voluntary local review, and found so much value in it that they started to talk about it with counterparts. You had other cities start to take this up. Helsinki committed to do it. There were a set of Japanese cities started to do so. LA took it up, and eventually Pittsburgh as well did their first VLR a couple of years later. But that movement has grown enormously from a small handful of cities, even globally. And the first generation of voluntary local reviews, I think the first year there were about 10. There are now over 300 cities, 300 plus cities signed up to do it. And if you can find a whole slew of voluntary local reviews that have been completed. And they come in different shapes and sizes, and they're part of the cultural context of that particular city, and depends on the capacity and the data that they have. But I think as a tool, they've been really important in helping city governments and the stakeholders that they work with in those cities sort of come to the sustainable development mindset, I guess I would say, the SDG mindset of that 3-in-1 we just talked about, that interdependence of those dimensions of development. And to start to hold themselves transparently accountable to what kind of progress they're making on those goals.
So a lot of what you've just noted is incredibly important and can be translated, I think, into actually other areas. We're talking about, as you know, creating a community of practice with students and faculty in a number of universities to teach and train differently on social justice and human rights using the SDGs. For a lot of the same reasons. Obviously, it's a different context. We don't govern, But we are trying to think in this 3-in-1 dimension and what that looks like. And as you note, the voluntary review is the way in which communities, whether at the national level, the local level, that's how people talk to one another about the SDGs. It takes different forms. We last year launched a voluntary university review. We'll shortly have our second one coming forward, and they innovate throughout, every time, every iteration. And of course, Carnegie Mellon has been involved in the VLR for Pittsburgh. A Heinz student was the main drafter, Kate Pendrak, with whom you've worked. But let's talk now about some of the best practices that you're seeing. And I don't know that stolen is the right word, but I think borrowed for sure, that there's lots of lessons learned. And that is a fundamental reason to have a community of practice, is so that different folks can share what these are. But in thinking about these best practices, I'm wondering if you're running into, or how you handle, or do you hear people say, oh, well, that's LA, or that's New York City, we're just Pittsburgh, or we're just Helsinki, or we've got a really different context, or if that kind of dynamic doesn't happen as much?
So that kind of dynamic actually happens at the very beginning of the conversation. They'll say, "Oh, we can't do that." Yeah, LA. You brought a staff person on to even do this, and you've got somebody sort of running the whole show. Not something that we're able to do, but we've tried to capture some of the lessons, not just the particular steps. We've tried to capture some of the how-tos and the lessons, and then just lay those out for different cities. And they find that they can actually adapt it or apply it most of the times to their particular way. And I think part of that is just in the framing to begin with. So LA, for example, went through a very laborious process of looking at every target under, the 169 targets that make up the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. And they looked at them word for word and sort of identified how they applied to LA and what LA's really version of those particular targets are. No other city really that I know of in the world has done it so meticulously, right? And that doesn't mean that that's the way you need to do it. And so, but sharing the objectives of what was behind that process, why they undertook that process, and they had the capacity to do so, usually provides a light bulb that goes off in the minds of the counterpart that might be a much smaller city, might have fewer staff, might have fewer resources, or even external partners, to be able to undertake something that fits them and that fits their own cultural context. In terms of best practices, I would say that there is, as I said, the discipline of the SDGs. So almost no city is taking on all 17 goals at once at the same level of priority, but they are thinking in terms of outcome-based, time-bound goals. Where are we going to get to by a certain time on a certain priority? Most cities are identifying 3 or 4 major priorities that are multidimensional, that have multidimensional aspects to them. And that's what they're also capturing through the VLRs that we just talked about. I think the thing to ensure, like even as they begin that process of what does it mean to make progress in sustainable development, it is a process, not just coming up with a final product that they're a report that they're going to put out, or the way that their strategy is around this. And so one of the things that we see a lot of is breaking down the silos internally amongst different city offices that have different initiatives that are focused on a specific thing. So you'll see the sustainability officer start to talk to the chief equity officer in a completely different way, right? And start to look at how they might understand how the initiatives that they're working on can be integrated or paired or reinforce each other in particular ways. You do see use of data especially in more a disaggregated way. Those could be disaggregated by demographics, say disaggregated by sex, disaggregated by race, also geospatially, disaggregated by neighborhood, so that you can really start to take the evidence that you have and pinpoint where the gaps and the big opportunities are as well. And that disaggregation starts new kinds of conversations as well within the city government, as you take that on. And then I think you're starting to see a growing set of practices around budget and financing and how resources get deployed. Pittsburgh, for example, has made it a priority, and they're learning actually from Mannheim and Bristol, all of whom are in this community of practice, on how their procurement policies could be adapted so that they are accelerating their progress on their sustainable development, the goals that they have and the objectives that they have through their sustainable development outlook, and how that can go into all the different ways in which they spend money and decide on how they're going to spend their money. And then I think the last thing I would say is that's been a really big theme out of the community of practice, and a lot of interesting innovation is around partnerships and governance. And when I say governance, I'm talking beyond government. So we talked about a little bit about breaking down the silos internally and how that changes how cities can work and function better and provide better services in a more integrated fashion that might make progress on certain dimensions all at once. But there's also governance, the city government in conjunction with lots of other stakeholders. And again, Pittsburgh, you already referred to it a bit. Great example of that. The university and the city government as well. You've got the business community there as well, using the SDGs in a particular way. And you see things like even at Bristol in the UK, where the SDGs being so integrated into the development of a city strategy from the beginning, and different stakeholders from business and philanthropy and the university being part of a set of boards, actually, that they call, that were an integral part of creating that portion of the strategy. And now that being the way in which city stakeholders sort of think about the vision together for their community and what their contributions are to be able to make progress. So it's not just up to the city government. It's not just the public revenues that are being spent on city services, but it's also, what's the role of business in making a contribution to that particular objective or initiative? What's the role of the university can play? What's the role that civil society and philanthropy can be playing as well?
So we've got a bunch of questions coming in, which we'll turn to in a minute. I want to press you on two things before we go on to what is not working, and maybe my prompts will get you there. One of the challenges that we find generally is that there's a lack of awareness that the SDGs even exist. This past Saturday, we saw a global event called the Global Citizen, which started before the SDGs, but was at some point was meant to be a platform to help raise awareness about the SDGs. And yet, even in the Global Citizen concert, it's barely mentioned. I'm wondering if you see some cities that are doing a particularly good job in engaging their citizens that this framework does exist and why it matters. I've heard that in Paris, at one point, there were billboards around the city letting people know, obviously, well, perhaps not obviously, but during High Level Week in New York, you often see private sector companies. I think Saks Fifth Avenue just had mirrors up with the SDGs. Pfizer would do that, just around the corner from UN headquarters. And then the second question is something that we found this summer working with students looking at Pittsburgh, Atlanta, and Toronto, that actually there's an absence of disaggregated data, and that oftentimes NGOs or local NGOs or national NGOs or students, universities are having to fill in the gap on the data. And it's a theme that came up in our 17 rooms conversation with the Brookings and Rockefeller flagship exercise. Wondered if you could comment on awareness and the data issues, and then we're going to turn to some of these questions before we get back to the regularly scheduled questions that I had sent to you.
Yeah, so in terms of levels of awareness, so levels of awareness in the US are fairly low, and there's even some sensitivity that cities, I think, they walk into that conversation with SDG branding even somewhat cautiously, because in the US we have you know, we can look, even the most progressive cities can look askance a bit at like global frameworks coming in from the outside as being the ways in which we ought to be thinking about things. We tend to be fairly provincial about, you know, this is our city, this is our problems, we'll know what to do, and so I think the one thing I would say on that note in the US is that what seems to have worked is for cities to start from the place of looking at their own local priorities, their local problems, their local opportunities that they want to pursue. Look at those through the context of the SDGs, but develop their own way of their own commitments around that, and then sort of engage sets of people and say, you know, everything that we've laid out here locally to solve our own local problems actually is quite harmonic with and fits in to this global movement called the SDGs. And if we make this local progress, we're actually also contributing global progress. And that becomes very exciting versus saying, oh, we're going to adopt the SDGs. And everybody says, what are those things? And like, why are we bringing something in from the outside? In terms of cities that actually, you know, there are many European cities actually that make it part of their strategy to communicate widely about the SDGs and to see general public awareness as a key component of what they think is important for the SDGs. Mannheim is a city that you're familiar with that, you know, in developing their city strategy, did both a survey, set of focus groups, but actually lots of events as well that had SDGs all over them. Utrecht in the Netherlands, also a very big public awareness campaign, and even a whole set of cities in Sweden funded actually through Swedish SIDA to do global awareness campaign in cities across Sweden on the SDGs. And so definitely a focus there. And you see it also in like Japanese cities. They are a formal part of the strategy that the national government actually has to make progress on the SDGs. And so the national government is in some respects providing them space to be a partner in promoting the SDGs as an important thing that the whole country ought to be behind and be supporting and trying to make progress on. So you certainly see it in other contexts. The US, it's not the predominant way in which, you know, we don't see cities just in very general public awareness campaigns, you know, promoting it, I would say.
Let's return to the data in a second, but I want to, just going deeper into this issue of what we're not seeing, that Swedish example is incredibly interesting. And I wonder if we couldn't elevate that a little bit more and nudge perhaps the Biden administration. We've talked a lot about the United States is at this moment the only of its peers, the only country that has not committed to do a national review, a voluntary national review. All G20, all OECD countries have done them. Some have done multiple ones. Um, there's been, I think most of us would say, ambivalence towards addressing the SDGs at the federal level. It goes up and down. You see the language in the G7 communique in June. It's mentioned here and there, and this goes to a question that's in the chat. What federal policies have you seen or would like to see to incentivize and support cities to adopt and pursue the SDGs? And if you would just maybe talk about Representative Ted Lieu's legislation that he is trying to advance, because I think having that State Department city office might also be a hook that we might use.
Well, to your point, Sarah, I think to begin with, it would be good for the federal government just to make a clear commitment on the SDGs, do a voluntary national review, because that creates, in some respects, both a baseline, but an organizing principle for many different stakeholders that are actually doing a lot of work using the SDGs and using sustainable development as a key objective. Everything from, leading corporations to the cities we've been discussing, philanthropies, universities, civil society. I mean, there's a lot of action actually happening in different segments of American society. But with the absence of the federal government, like there's not a clear rallying platform, let's say. And I think that given the leadership that local elected officials have shown on the SDGs during this absence, first from the Trump administration and now without clear signals from the Biden administration, I think there's a real opportunity for the US to do a voluntary national review in a much different way. By leveraging that leadership and acknowledging it and actually bringing it in an unusual way together with the federal government than just what we often think of or see at the UN that most national governments do, which is they task their different offices or departments within their national government apparatus. They collect a bunch of data and then they put a report on the table that's basically run through their diplomatic lens and want the messaging and things that they want to emphasize. I think there's a real opportunity for leveraging the local leadership, and not just the local leadership in the US, to your point, but how their leadership globally on this agenda with their global counterparts provides even another foothold for sort of US credibility overseas that our State Department and our diplomatic ranks could really leverage. And that speaks to the office that you were referring to, that Representative Lieu and other legislators have put a proposal on the table to create a formal office on city and state diplomacy within the State Department that would actually have Foreign Service officers seconded into cities and states for a couple-year tour to be helping them with their global engagements, especially on global policy, and create a real clear, open channel of communication between cities and states and the federal government on global policy issues. Because most of those issues are transnational issues. And look at what happened with COVID. I mean, who were the first responders, the frontline responders of COVID? It was our city governments and our states, right? And so they are implicated in all these transnational issues as well. And I think, the federal government actually even has an opportunity, not just with people, but it could create a platform, sort of a 2030 alliance in the US where there was also funding available. You see Canada doing that. They're making small grants available to localities, to local institutions that are taking on the SDGs in particular ways. We did a roundtable recently where we're looking at the climate agenda as it intersects with the SDG agenda, and people in San Diego who are taking very seriously and decarbonization plans and what that would look like in San Diego and San Diego County. I mean, their point was, look, It's great to have the national commitments and the policy commitments that the administration is making on climate, but the delivery is actually going to happen at the local level. So in order to scale that up, we're going to need a great deal of support from the federal level so that we're not reinventing the wheel in every guise. So when we think about land use policies, when we think about, energy transition, when we do all these sorts of things, even as we do the planning, we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel, let alone like the resources that need to be invested to make that transition.
There's so many policies that this administration is advancing that elegantly align with the SDGs. On some level, I have to think this is just a matter of time. Similarly, I have to think that it's just a matter of time before there is that city-state office, because there's so much action. In many places, the city's economy is that of many countries or larger. I'm thinking of Houston or Los Angeles. So you touched on the climate.
Not only does the administration's policies like elegantly align, they actually have the multidimensional thinking.
Right.
If you looked at the executive order on climate that they promulgated like a week into the administration that the president signed, it is like, and you look at the mandate that the climate advisor's office has and what they are supposed to be organizing around, it is not just, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but doing that by creating good paying jobs, environmental justice, making sure that those jobs are getting to those who are usually cut out, and that there's an inclusive economy around all this. It's so that even the mindset is there. But as you said, they haven't taken that final step and said, this is indicative and clearly reflective of a commitment to the SDGs, and we're going to hold ourselves transparently accountable to the targets, and we're going to see how much progress we can make on them.
Indeed, the first executive order stood up a working group for disaggregated data to challenge and advance social justice and tackle racial inequities. So yes, there's lots to elevate and choose from and wrap through on the SDGs. We touched on a lot of times. I mean, part of another challenge is that, and we see this oftentimes at CMU, when people think about sustainability, and we have a sustainability initiative, they think that it's about only climate. It is about climate and also many other things. So let's talk for a second about positive outcomes you're seeing in terms of equity. Is there an SDG effect that you're seeing? And let me just tie this into a question that's in the chat. How do you see the perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion that has evolved over the past 18 months, the impact of COVID, the George Floyd murder and the protests that followed, the impending bills that are in Congress? Has the SDGs become even more important now in cities? I think those of us who are deeply engaged with the SDGs feel that, if anything, the confluence of all these crises has elevated the urgency. Absolutely. But to Karen's question, how do you see it?
So I actually see, so not only did it elevate the urgency of the SDGs and the urgency around those issues of inequity, but actually I think in the US specifically, it opened the door for a greater appetite amongst a wider array of people to embrace the SDGs, to learn more about them, and to see how the intersection of that leave no one behind theme of the SDGs, which is a core pillar, right? It's about reaching the most vulnerable first, how that intersects with an agenda around addressing the legacy of systemic racism, addressing issues of gender inequity. And you've seen leaders, I think, begin to become SDG fluent, frankly, who have been working on these issues for a long time, because I think they see the added value of reflecting back where we are in the US within a global framework, and being able to point out the work that needs to happen, and get sort of the global solidarity, like to link up to how this is playing out globally. So I also think that and this relates to what we were just talking about before, you know, the Build Back Better agenda, which is what the president calls that agenda of like an economic transformation coming out of COVID that addresses historic inequities, is, you know, that first language was actually like the UN Secretary General using it, right? And using the SDGs as the blueprint for it. So to say that, you know, there's some alignment there. But Sarah, I do think that comes back to your point around disaggregation of data, because it also provides another entry point for advocates in the US to push for that. And it is missing more than you think it is. Like, we're doing some analysis right now, like where the US might be on the SDGs. And it's amazing how hard it is to get that kind of disaggregated data at the national level, and like you say, also at the local level. It's not easy, and it provides, I think, some political momentum. Like the SDGs provide us another lever for some political momentum to make sure that we're getting that kind of data.
Right. If you take seriously leave no one behind, then you have to know who is being left behind, and you cannot do it without the disaggregated data. I've become an opponent of aggregated data. I see it as masking so many inequities, so many problems, and this gets us to an interesting question that really touches, I think, on a tension that exists but is not discussed very much. The thing that animates me about the SDGs is it gets us out of a post-Cold War way of looking at the global North versus the global South, and talking about countries, as we often do in the multilateral arena, as developed versus developing. When you look inside high-income countries, you see these inequities. And to talk about a developed country and then leaving people literally behind doesn't help. But when you get into the multilateral setting, and you know, you were there in the negotiation over SDG 17, which a lot of us oftentimes we translate into an SDG around partnership, but it had very specific meanings for the countries that were negotiating it. And so the question here is, do the nations leading in SDG pursuance have a responsibility to help post-colonial nations develop the strategies and technologies to pursue the SDGs? And indeed, there are a number of targets in Goal 17 that specifically go to those issues. But so many times we seem, and we even hear this from UN officials, they continue to act as if the SDGs only apply to the global South when they apply to everybody. So do you want to take that on?
Yeah, and it's not just Goal 17, but it's also the means of implementation targets, you know, that are dotted throughout as well. We're basically, and the thing to keep in mind is that the SDGs also have a companion piece around financing, right? And the whole agenda around financing, which has sort of gotten a little bit lost because of COVID and because of all of the different kinds of, you know, the different things that we've been dealing with over the past couple of years. But I think it's really important, and I think this is also where the US is missing out a little bit, because we haven't just baldly recommitted. Because I think a country like the US needs to be a leader both globally as well as domestically on this agenda. But it's hard to be credible globally just with your money. And as a few folks said at this event that, you know, we did with the UN Foundation last week, We are into a place where, as you so aptly described, development is a continuum, and we need to be looking at where we all are on that continuum, and nobody has solved it, 100%, right? I mean, we're going to do our analysis of where the U.S. is on the SDGs, and we're not going to reach a whole slew of the targets, right? And a lot of the targets are around inequality and people and communities that are being left behind. So we have to sort of start to have some humility about where we are all as countries and societies on that continuum. And I think increasingly countries, especially those coming out of colonial relationships and others, are increasingly looking to be peers rather than, just recipients. I do think that that's one of the politics around that have been much easier within our community of practice amongst cities, because there's not the historical political legacy of those government leaders coming together. But it's been fascinating and really energizing, actually, to see how much they're learning from each other. And it's not just one way. It's not just the quote unquote, developed cities with their innovations to the less developed cities. There's honest, authentic learning going two ways in those conversations. And I think that's where the global community wants to see. At the same time, the financing and the commitments do need to be there. I mean, that's a big part, as you say, of the SDGs, and it's a big part of resetting what the inequalities are between countries as well. And we have to be sensitive to that. We have to be intentional about that.
We need to be able to walk and talk at the same time. One of the ways in which we can walk and talk, and this is a big theme, both in terms of, frankly, just best practices at doing governance, but also in a conversation on global development, is the need for elevated voice, localization. And yet the number of time, what that means concretely is, rather than having whatever development is going on, rather than it being supply side, right? So you've got NGOs in Washington or New York or Geneva, wherever, going to another place and saying, I'm here from Washington, I'm here to help you. Having the local voice be really elevated in terms of what is needed and responding. Who do you see elevating the voice of residents in how they address the SDGs? And why is localization, I mean, is that the right word for it? And why isn't it not obvious that this is a good way to govern? Why do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of appetite. Like, I think there's a lot of leaders who think, citizen participation, localization, all of that is probably at the heart of being able to make progress and accelerate progress. But there also there also is sort of accountability pressures from lots of different sides that gets in the way, and there's also perceptions that get in the way. Perceptions of risk, perceptions, lack of relationships, lack of networks and social capital, just even direct relationships, and lack of knowledge, who is really representing whom, who has the authority to represent whom. All those become really sticky and important questions when you talk about quote unquote localization.
Let's call them the 3 R's: risk, relationship, and representation. I think that. Yeah, that's good. We need to tackle that. I want to touch on the role of students, but before we get there, I want to address the issue about land use and also health. The first question is, do you see any examples of cities specifically looking at and revising their land use policies as a key component of sustainability?
Yeah, but only at the beginning, like there's only at the beginning of doing this. I mean, I couldn't, I mean, I wouldn't say that I've seen, there's certainly cities that are looking for ways to address issues of mobility, of shelter, of commerce in more integrated ways and more inclusive ways. Everything from the 15-minute city to, you know, even the donut economics of Amsterdam, for example. I'm not, and
But isn't it the case that, for example, Grant Irvin in Pittsburgh was looking at trying to make sure that there were green spaces in
yeah,
all sorts of neighborhoods? I mean,
yes, and Louisville's doing the same thing, for example, and doing it in a way that is also about, you know, better well-being, and they're actually measuring actually health impacts out of that green space. I mean, I think the difficulty that I have always, you know, answering a question that's specific about like health or specific about land use or something like that, is that again, when you're thinking in a multidimensional way, it's a part of, but not the sole driver of. And so certainly I think you're seeing more and more strategies that take these things into account, but they may even be quote unquote co-benefits or secondary benefits to the initiative itself, I guess is what I would say.
so here's a tough question, which I think can be turned around into a reason why. How can we expect the U.S. to uphold I'm going to insert a word, global leadership position in equitable and sustainable development when the federal government has yet to make a clear commitment to a voluntary national review? This is from Scott. In my opinion, that appears as imposition without accountability from the perspective of other global actors and peers. And that would make a good op-ed coming from the G6.
I was just going to say, we can just cut and paste that and send it into a few people that we might know in government.
Yes, yes.
Say, here's what's going to happen when you go to speak to your counterparts globally.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think that it is probably just a matter of time before when it may indeed, well, we hope it's happening, that is exactly what they're hearing from their peers. I want to just jump back to
and frankly, it's also what the president said in his UN speech.
Yes.
We will rally people to action by the example, by our own example. And so it's just holding the administration accountable for the way in which it's even framing how it wants to lead globally.
So we just have a few minutes left. I do want to talk about the good health and wellness SDG. The question is, if you have any cities to highlight that have been working towards good health and wellness in the US and what they are implementing to solve this issue. I would also tack on, because I think there are probably a lot of international or cities outside the United States that are particularly focused on this.
Yeah, and like, so for example, with LA, when they did their initial voluntary local review and they were disaggregating data, they found, for example, maternal mortality at much higher rates in certain communities, especially communities of color, that they decided needed to be addressed and needed for them to focus down on. There's also a set of cities in the US that are now looking for ways for the action that they're taking on climate, trying to see how that action on climate change also can have health benefits and promote greater well-being, especially around traditionally disenfranchised communities or communities that have been left outside of that. I will say that the community, that the cities in our community of practice, again, it's been more of a co-benefit than it's been a driver of their strategies around health. The partly also that's a governance thing though, because like even LA City doesn't, like they don't have jurisdiction over their health system. It's the LA County, right? And so you run into like these jurisdictional issues. So they're looking at things where they might have managerial control versus things where they have to be sort of an informal leader and partner with others that actually have the jurisdictional control.
There's also,
even, you know, and there's the health systems themselves are sometimes private and nonprofit and things like that they're trying to partner with. I know that's what's happening in Pittsburgh.
well, indeed, actually, there's a 2019 report in part, I think, by University of Pittsburgh around the same issues that they found in LA on maternal mortality and disaggregated by race that I think also played into how they're dealing with it. We have just 3 minutes left, and I do want you to talk about the role of students. Again, LA here is such a great example. We have a lot of work with students on the SDGs, but if you just could talk for a second about the role of students, and then how transportation, we have a lot of students and scholars of transportation in the 21st century at CMU and at Heinz in particular. How do you see transportation fitting into as a key area that could be improved to address the SDGs? And of course, there's also restorative justice in terms of where and how transportation was put together.
So that's one particular part of it, how to actually increase mobility, especially and address issues of inequity, even just through greater mobility. Transportation is also many times part of global greenhouse gas emissions, and so cleaner, greener ways of transportation, I think, is actually really important as well. And even the land use decisions that come around transportation and how that drives shelter, education, a whole host, health services, a whole host of things that are related to the SDGs. So it is actually a linchpin, and it's one thing that many of the cities that we work with have top of mind, because it is something that, again, they play a big part of. That's where they have jurisdictional control. And it's a blueprint. The other thing to keep in mind for transportation is you're generally developing it through infrastructure that is going to be around for a long time. Right. So the decisions you make now are going to have impact for 30 years. Around students, pretty much every city that we have been working with that's been making progress on this has partnerships with universities, and students are playing a big role in helping the cities do analysis, think of policy solutions, figure out what they might do. So there's just even, at a very basic level, I think a lot of opportunity. But I also would say that students are the future. That's the next generation of leadership that's coming. We've talked over and over today about the interdisciplinary nature of the SDGs and how to be thinking in a holistic manner. And I think I actually think that it's students and this generation that is able to do that probably more facilely and more easily, and are more comfortable doing that than you and I are, from the kind of schooling we got and the kind of way we approach the world and the specialization that we had. And so I'm looking for a lot of leadership from students as they're both in their programs and come out of their programs.
We call them cohort 2030, and that's the reason why we need to partner with them, because they're also more facile with technology than some of us. So, and especially if you're getting an education at Carnegie Mellon, then there's the whole layers of data and data analytics. Tony, it's at the top of the hour, mindful of everybody's day that they need to get on with. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your leadership on this. It's going to be one day when everybody's talking about the SDGs, and we'll know who the initial people were who were talking about them. So we'll keep engaging. I know on these issues, and we'll see you next time. I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you, Robin Cole and Marie Coleman and Jackie Speedy, for helping get people into these Zooms and keeping us on time. And everybody be safe, be well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.